Today we are once again veering off on a tangent. This is now our 10th, and this time it is to look at Satan, also known as the devil, Lucifer, and the inventor of baked beans. If those aren't evil, I don't know what is. There are basically three parts to this that I find particularly interesting. And the first one is that there seems to be a very big difference between the idea of a non-physical creator creating a universe and that non-physical creator permitting someone else to run around within that universe and basically mess it up and divert people from what we're supposed to be here for. Based on what we know so far from science about the beginnings and origins of life and the universe, we have at least established that it's not unreasonable to think that potentially some being did it, and that would, by definition, I suppose, be God. And it's said that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince the world he doesn't exist. Is that from Usual Suspects? Might be more profound, but in my head I remember it from The Usual Suspects. Oddly, that would sort of make sense for the devil to stay hidden, but it wouldn't make sense for God in the sense that we're supposed to find our way to him. So if he convinced us we didn't exist, that would not be congruent with that whole idea. But it also, I think, raises the question of whether the devil is actually a real entity or a metaphor. And it's difficult to untangle that. So far, I've not long read the book of Job, which is where the devil has his big part, as it were. He turned up briefly in the first book of Chronicles before that, but it sounded quite metaphorical in that context. And in the story of Job, it sounded very literal because he was turning up and going to meetings and all sorts. But it's in the context of a story that's not literally true. So neither of those really help us to work out if we're supposed to take the devil seriously or not. I did wonder whilst reading the book of Job, the idea, could that be where people get the idea that the devil is real from? As in all the rest of the context, could it be metaphorical? And it's only in this one book of the Bible where he's turning up and going to meetings and having conversations and stuff that seems to make out that he's a real entity. But of course, as I said, in the context of a story that's not literally true anyway, and not claiming to be literally true. I do think actually that's probably wrong. But it's an interesting idea, and I do think that is a part of the devil question that you do have to tackle. I must admit, I do have a pretty hard time with the idea that there's this whole heavenly host of other characters, as it were, out there, which obviously in Job is illustrated, but this idea, if we've got to take the devil seriously, then that's sort of what that implies. But it's a bit silly to have an objection to that, obviously, because if God exists and created the universe, then it's perfectly reasonable that he could have created spiritual stuff as well. So I don't quite know why I have a bigger problem with the idea of Bible and heavenly hosts than I do with the rest of it. I guess because potentially it all just seemed a little bit more far-fetched. I mean, the universe is here and we can't explain why. So, I mean, okay, there's some credence to that question. But the rest of it we don't seem to have any tangible indications for. Therefore, slightly problematic. And you'd think actually the church would tend to lean away from that sort of thing, lest it gets sort of lumped in with the idea of sort of the Greek myths of Zeus and all the rest of it. But I don't think it does. So I guess if it's true, then you wouldn't lean away from that. But yeah, it is a weird thing. I'm also in the middle of formatting the journal my father started writing when he was first diagnosed with cancer back in 2001. And he wrote this thing for 11 months up until he died. And in this, he makes several references to old Red Sox and spiritual warfare. And it's almost like implying the idea that Liz Hurley's out there running around trying to tempt us into doing things we shouldn't be doing in order to lead us astray. And it makes it more difficult, of course, because as most people tend to, the default setting for how you think of your father is a bit of a Superman. Imperfect, obviously. But, you know, he's an intelligent, wise, discerning, sensible guy. So yeah, how does he think that Liz Hurley's running around doing all this stuff? I mean, maybe he doesn't actually think it's Liz Hurley, but you know, you get the idea. As mentioned in a previous video, I recently bought my local vicar lunch to throw all sorts of horrible questions at him, which he did a great job of handling and actually seemed to enjoy, actually. I think so. What some people do for fun is, well, there we go. And I asked him the question, do I need to be thinking of the devil as a metaphor or real? And his very well worded responses, without managing to sound all woo-woo and all the rest of it. Basically, yeah, I got to be thinking of the devil as an actual entity that is running around. Simon the Vicar did also put me onto the Screw Tape Letters by our old friend Clive Lewis. This is brilliant, well worth a read for anyone. It's fictional, obviously, but it's basically devils writing to each other, giving them advice on how to steer humans, and it's an interesting sort of inverse psychological profile on humans. The book also contains the idea that the devil is quite happy if we're sort of enthralled with him, so Ouija boards and all that sort of crazy stuff, or if we're just in complete unawareness, not thinking about him whatsoever. Either of those two conditions the devil's happy with, which would make sense if there was a devil, I think. It's those middle conditions where I guess it's a bit less fertile ground for a devil to lead humans astray. But probably makes more sense if you read the book. But it's quite short, so it's well worth it and very easy to read. So definitely worth having a flick through. An example, I suppose, of how C.S. Lewis is talking about it is he talks about his screw tape writing to his nephew, who's another sub-devil, as it were, talking about the benefit in getting humans to direct their benevolence towards something very far away and their malice towards something close. You'd think that ought to be the other way around, potentially. But a good example might be sort of the slightly militant activist who's passionate about some cause far away, but then is hostile to everyone around them because they're not equally as excitable about it. And the book is just full of those sort of little examples of, oh yeah. Until recently, all I'd read of C.S. Lewis was the Chronicles of Narnia, which are brilliant, obviously. But his philosophical stuff is genius. I mean, in terms of how he picks out very simple, everyday things you almost wouldn't notice, and then draws out, okay, well, that could be that and that could be that. Even if you don't agree with him in terms of what it's all about, in terms of theology, it's a very interesting study on human nature. I guess ultimately this is where I hit my brick wall on open-mindedness. I just can't quite get past that idea that there's devils and all this other stuff running around. And it's kind of risk, is that the right word, of where it goes from sort of a sensible idea that, okay, yes, I get you could make a case for God, but you start making cases for devils and things running around doing weird stuff and ghosts and goblins and demons. It all feels like it goes off into the weeds of just being a little bit silly. I don't mean that to sound as terrible as that would to Christianity. I mean that just purely as a reflection of how I feel on it. And yeah, a slightly tricky one that's going to be difficult to deal with. Anyway, the second part of it that I find interesting is the idea that the problem of evil, I get, is okay. I don't see why that would disprove God at all. Evil existing is exactly as you would expect if God existed, in the conditions as set out by the Bible. Obviously for Christianity, it doesn't help, I don't think, because it's exactly what you expect if there wasn't a God as well. So it's sort of neutral in that respect. But the idea that someone is deliberately going around trying to tempt us into doing things, that's a sort of a negativity drag on us that doesn't need to be there, surely. Like the model is intact if human beings are just put on the earth and then can choose God or not choose God, and off they go, and they're not interfered with. I guess it's that idea of sort of entrapment, isn't it? It's like if the police go and set you up to commit a crime and then arrest you for it, that's not, in the movies at least, that's not allowed. I assume that's probably not allowed in real life as well. And it's that same sort of idea. So I completely get that God couldn't afflict Hitler's head off because that would have just been to remove free will by some sort of weird back door. But if God does permit someone external to the physical world to go around messing things up for the rest of us, it's not clear why that's necessary, and it just seemed a little bit like an extra torture that wasn't required, and it's difficult to reconcile that with the idea of a pleasant God. Obviously, I've seen lots of videos on here. There's this arrogance problem with atheism that sort of treats it as it can't be true because it's not how I would do it if I was God, which is by definition obviously extraordinarily arrogant to think that we could think on God's level. And that is exactly what I'm doing here. I'm quite aware of that. But it doesn't change the fact that you've got to have an idea in your head, and then you've got to be able to make peace with it. Otherwise you can't move forward. And I guess that's ultimately where I am. So I'm not arguing God doesn't exist because the devil would be silly, but I'm just saying that because of what we know and understand so far and what I've seen and what I've read in the Bible, my reasoning prevents me from getting beyond that to accepting that devils and demons and ghosts and that were all real. Simon the Vicar did have an interesting angle on this, which I'm still wrestling with and I can't quite get to grips with. And I hope I'm doing him justice here in terms of reflecting what he actually said. But he was talking about it in terms of the origins of Satan is as the accuser. And I guess if you think of that in the terms of some sort of hyperactive lawyer who's been appointed by the state to prosecute a criminal or something like that, in that context, it starts to make a bit more sense, I think. But yeah, that would sort of make sense if you were tied together with the idea that some sort of growth comes through us wrestling with this. And then it gives the devil a useful purpose, perhaps. But then perhaps you're just trying to fit the ideas to make it suit what you want the end result to be in terms of it making sense. That definitely wouldn't be fair, obviously, but then who says life is fair? And would it be brave of me to say, of someone I don't believe exists, the devil, that I don't have any sense in my life of some dark force working against me? And I know some people very definitely do. So that would suggest that if that is a thing and that is what is happening to those people, that seems a little unfair. I guess there's an argument that my life is reasonably devoid of hardship, and my father died when I was younger. I'm divorced, so it's not been the smoothest, shelterest life ever. But I'm aware that a lot of people have had a far worse time than I have. But perhaps it's as simple as I'm lucky in that when things go wrong for me, I tend to sort of look at it as c'est la vie and we move on. Or perhaps, of course, that's asking for massive trouble. I'm just being completely flippant about terrible things that aren't happening to me because it happens that everything's kind of okay at the minute. Brave or what? Talking smack about the devil on camera, and well, we'll see, I guess, won't we? It's also possible, of course, that my left brain noggin just can't cope with things happening that are subtle and just doesn't notice them. Don't know. The third part, though, is an interesting angle on it for theism. If devils and demons and ghosts were shown to exist, which I appreciate you can't really do. Well, maybe you can. I'd say there's evidence of exorcisms, apparently, if you believe the exorcists. Personally, I struggle with that, but there we go. So it would be almost like a backdoor way of proving God existed. Or at least, I've talked before about the idea that people who believe in all things spiritual, it seems odd that you could hold that there are spiritual things beyond the physical universe as we see it, and then not believe that there's a God that created it, because the fact that those non-physical things existed make it, okay, well, great, yeah, as far as you're concerned, it's proved that there are things beyond the physical universe. So, yeah, God would make the most sense, surely. I need to be a bit careful here, because I'm acutely aware that one person watching this is actually in that camp and does not feel compelled. So, clearly it doesn't work like that, even if I feel like it should. The problem for me, of course, is that I don't believe in those devils and things and all the rest of it anyway, so it doesn't help. But it does seem that someone who does believe in that sort of thing, all spiritual stuff, it would surely be less of a leap for them to get to the idea of a God than it would be for me, I think, maybe. But yeah, so I have admittedly failed to reach any sort of conclusion on this, but I have at least got straight in my own head that the devil is a more problematic idea for me than God is, which is really odd. I mean, I fully acknowledge that makes no sense at all. But there we go. And this investigation has at least led to the understanding that, okay, we are supposed to be treating the devil as an actual spiritual being who lives outside the universe and is a sentient thing. If, though, the devil is true, I'm going to close this where I think there are two remaining problems. One is the question of what are the limits on Satan's power. I mean, in Job, he kills people and gives Job leprosy and all sorts of horrible things, but again, not a literal story, so it's not supposed to be a real thing. I mean, can the devil knock your house down and give you cancer and that sort of stuff? Or is he just the sort of little voice in your head tempting you to go and do fun things that, with some discipline, you have maybe a shot at choking? And the other problem is, why would the devil reject God? On the basis that our purpose in life, as far as Christianity is concerned, is to have that relationship with God, and that would be a wonderful thing. The devil presumably knows God and knows what is on offer by God and has chosen to reject it. So, yeah, how do you reconcile someone understanding what's on offer not wanting that? So it's a kind of a dark and difficult question, that one. So we will move on anyway and see if we can find some more answers in the Bible.